Good afternoon. Oh, this is awesome. Okay, so you're here for Spring Boot as a teaching tool. My name is Alton Henley. I'm the Senior Director of the Information Technology Institute at Montgomery College, and I teach a programming boot camp that now uses Spring Boot. Now, a lot of people give their history. My background, the only background that matters, is what languages have I programmed in. I started programming in COBOL when I went to class with my mom when I was 9. And throughout time, I've learned Fortran, Basic Assembly, C, C++, so on and so forth, up and through Swift. I would have to say that many of those languages were harder to learn than they needed to be, but none of them were as easy to learn to me as Spring Boot. You?
Hi, my name's Efia Ankoma, and I'm an instructor at Montgomery College under Alton's programs. And my stack, I started programming when I was 15 years old with QBasic, and then eventually did a bunch of other languages, PHP, Python, fell in love with it, then encountered Java. So I've worked in technology since I was 18 as a developer, and I came to Montgomery College to further my knowledge in cybersecurity.
Now, what we learned about each other and what we see in a lot of our students is way too many students have C++ as a starter language. I don't think C++ is a good choice as a starter language for a variety of reasons. Now, the pluses of C++ are, if you can make it through C++ and still like programming, then you're pretty much a beast, right? You get high respect, even if it's the only language you know. I have seen people, classmates, they go in for a job in Java or ASP.NET or something like that, and they say, all I know how to program is C++, and they're like, you'll figure it out. And your hard work is behind you. Every other language, by comparison, except for maybe assembly, is pretty much easier to learn than C++. You don't have to worry about memory management. You may or may not have to worry about pointers. But the negative aspect is it has such a high learning curve and such conceptual complexity that when you're teaching a new group of students, teaching them C++ is really a hard habit to start them with. And it's not really all that fun. So when we started our boot camp, we started doing a survey of our students and asking them, what was your first language? Have you ever had any experience programming? Over 50% of the students that said that they took a programming class and never programmed again until they came to our boot camp were ones who started with C++. They took C++ in high school, they took C++ their first year in college, they changed their majors, and they never looked at it again. This is your language.
Well, Alton refuses to claim it, and it's a favorite of many developers because it is so easy. It's easy to deploy, it's easy to learn, it's easy to write the wrong way. And the most popular installed bases include WordPress, which we're all familiar with, whether we like it or not. And then minuses, it's easy to deploy insecurely. As I mentioned before, it's really easy to make all sorts of mistakes, make vulnerable applications. And as I mentioned before, I did come to Montgomery College to further my knowledge in cybersecurity. I was able to find holes all over the place in applications that didn't actually use frameworks. It's easy to learn wrong. It has installed bases like Moodle, which we tend to use but don't necessarily like.
Now, a language that became very popular very quickly was Ruby on Rails, and I have to admit that I jumped on the bandwagon for about 50 seconds myself. And the reason is because students can learn Ruby on Rails so quickly. It has a very low barrier to entry and a very quick path to success. And what I mean by a path to success is not can you write a program, but can you write something that your mother will recognize as a program. So anyone who's seen one of the demos with Ruby on Rails knows that with like 4 generators, you can create an application that has 5 screens. It is do your basic CRUD application, and you haven't written a line of code yourself. And you're able to stand on the shoulders of giants. There's all of these different pieces that have been developed by other people for security, for talking to social media accounts, for sending text messages that you don't have to write them yourselves. However, deployment, other than a Heroku, I have to give it to them, but deployment on almost anything else is a hassle. So the people who are starting with Ruby on Rails tend to be people who have low technical expertise, and you're asking them to deploy what's actually one of the harder stacks to deploy, especially when you compare it to PHP, when it's merely a matter of FTPing some files up. The growth curve is a cliff, basically. And as soon as you get past the basic generator stuff with Ruby on Rails, you immediately jump into a new stratosphere. And for a lot of students, especially the ones with no technical background, it is a very, it's where they end up dropping off. And it has a tepidly huge job market. It's bigger than what I think it should be, but it's by no means large. So if you had all the students in the country learning Ruby on Rails, I don't know what jobs they would get with Ruby on Rails. They would probably end up having to learn some other language later on. And if it is the only language that you have listed on your resume, if it's the only language that you know, most people that I know don't consider you to know how to program. It just isn't. So if you have Ruby on Rails, then you should also have something else. So when I got the grant, by the way, the programming bootcamp is free. We got a Department of Labor grant that allows us to teach it for 8 weeks, full-time, all day, every day, for free for our students. I considered PHP for like 30 seconds. That wasn't going to do it. Ruby on Rails wasn't going to do it. And so we looked at Java EE, or as it's known now as Jakarta. And the positives were that Java is very popular. And I don't mean popular as in people love it. I mean popular as in there are more jobs in Java than everything else. And it's more jobs in Java than like the next 3 contenders combined. It's good for learning and it's well respected. So if Java is the only thing on your resume, and this is one of my main concerns for my students, it isn't a negative necessarily. One of the negatives though is the fragility. I don't know that if you guys have experienced it, and I actually haven't experienced it so much myself, but somehow my students have the ability to break a Java install. There's 3 or 4 in every class, and we don't know what they're doing. So we provide the machines. It's Windows 10, IntelliJ, they have Tomcat, everything was installed by IT. Literally, by the end of the first week, someone's broken their install. None of their applications will work. None of our applications will work, and we don't know what they did, which is a problem. It shouldn't be that easy to break. It's a lot of work to get simple things working, and Java's not fun. Regular Java isn't fun. I know that's not a popular thing to say, but GitHub is on record as showing that Java has more commits up until 6:30 than any other language, and then the number of commits for Java crater at 10:30, which basically says that all of those people who are doing Java during the day, they're programming in something else at night. So we found, I came across Spring, and through the course of trying to figure out how to make things more stable for my students, I came across Spring Boot, and pretty much fell in love. The whole convention over configuration standard that was one of my favorite things about Ruby on Rails was there, which meant that there was a set of rules that I could just kind of force my students into and not have to worry about them setting a bunch of XML files. It was relatively quick for them to get started, and it's what I call a slippery slope to complex code. With Spring Boot, it's very easy for me to teach a student how to write a basic CRUD application and to take them to the next step where they're validating their data, and take them to the next step where they're then committing their data to 2 tables instead of 1, and to take them to their next step where they're working with some business logic before they do their commits. All of those things are easy to do without it being a huge jump in understanding between them, and it's really worked out well for our students. And the students kind of find their own level. I have students who, we have one already, as a matter of fact, Andrew, who we're in the 2nd week of a boot camp right now, and he wants to know why I have to accept these settings that Spring Boot is setting for me. Why can't I set them myself? And it's like, okay, well, it's time to teach you about Spring and the world that you're going to get yourself into. But there's other students that they're perfectly fine with it the way it is. They don't ever need to know any more complexity than they have. The minuses, and I had to search to find these, especially as a teaching tool, security is not exactly what I would want it to be. There's a lot to do in order to make a program secure. Given what Spring Boot is, I would hope that there would be the ability to just, out of the box, if you don't set anything, it automatically says, well, you have a users table, you have a roles table, and we're just going to set that for you. And that's just because, as a teacher, security is the biggest part of what we teach, and it's actually something we have to break up into like 5 different parts in order for them to wrap their heads around it. And if anything, it does too much. So when we started working with Spring Boot, Fee was very fond of Lombok and Rue, and once we started thinking about including all of those things, there was too much that was being done to the students and not enough for them to learn, and so we actually had to take those parts out.
Do you want me to do EDS? No,
okay, well, yeah, the EDS Training Program.
Do you want me to talk about how we got into Spring Boot and how
Sure.
Okay, all right. So as you can tell, Alton's very high energy. I'm the yin to his yang. So what ended up happening was that he came in all excited. He's like, we found this absolutely wonderful new platform. And I was like, okay, great. I know Java. Would you like to introduce me to it? So we actually had lunch and learns while we had our Java boot camps. The Java boot camps are 9 to 5 boot camps. We teach during the entire day. And so during lunch, high energy Alton said, with my colleague Dave, I'll sit you down during lunch and I'll teach you this Spring Boot thing. He likes to claim that it's because of our experience as professional developers. We were able to bootstrap things relatively quickly and get into the meat of what is Spring Boot. And then also lift that up and start touching Spring underneath. But it has a very, very, very easy, it's very easy to get into once you actually know what the basics are. And so it's actually easy for you to, as he said about Ruby on Rails, deploy or develop something that your grandmother would be able to recognize as an application relatively quickly.
Okay, so like I said, I've been doing this for a long time. I ran into one of the best developers I met when I was working at Amtrak, with someone who I found out through the course of talking over the water cooler, had started out as an administrative assistant at EDS, and then she became a programmer. And I was like, I don't know how that's possible, and had a bachelor's in accounting. But apparently in the 90s, EDS had a training program that for over 12 weeks, anybody could join the training program. They would introduce news topics on Monday, and you had something that you had to have running by Friday at close of business. If you had it running by Friday at close of business, you could come back on Monday. If you didn't, and you were a janitor, by Monday you were back pushing a broom. That was just the way that it worked. So she claimed that it was extremely stressful, but over the course of that time, and this is back in the time of COBOL, DB2, JCL, over the course of 12 weeks, she learned how to become a database-oriented COBOL developer from a cold start. And she started working as a developer 12 weeks later. And that just kind of blew me away, because I had been slowly learning program over my entire life at that point. And I really loved the idea of that. And so my entire career in education, once I switched over from development, was in search of creating a program like this and finding, clearly it's not COBOL, finding the right language to teach it in. And so we created the CodeWork Academy. Which is 8 weeks, 9 to 5. We've kept the weekly challenges. So they are basically sitting there writing code as we're teaching them all week long, and there is a Friday challenge. This Friday's challenge is the resume, Robo Resume?
Oh, they've done the Robo Resume already.
Oh, invoice?
Yes. So
they're doing an invoice application. This is week 2. By the time we get to the end of week 8, they're doing workflow applications. 90% of their time is spent coding, which means they spend 260 to 280 hours writing code over the course of this time. And their backgrounds range from having no experience to having 5 years experience. And in fact, 2 of my students are in here right now. And it is, like I said, it's completely free to the student. For some of you, this may seem foreign to you, but in the 90s, every class was taught in a language. So if you were taking data structures, you were writing the data structures codes in COBOL. If you were taking data communications, you were writing the code in COBOL. Everything that you were learning, you had to show that you actually knew what it was by writing code that used it. So by the time that you were done, every assignment was in code, every test was in code. If you were an IS major, which some people see as being the light major, you had probably written code for like 1,000 hours by the time you would graduate. And if you were a CS major, you had spent 2,500 hours writing code. We were in the lab day and night. We lived in the lab. We spent way too much time in the lab. And that's not the way things are now, because textbook vendors have gotten very good. They're trying to justify their $400 prices. And they have test pools and self-grading assignments and everything that require students to like answer the question, but not necessarily write full programs. And we did a survey before we created this. And apparently now, the average student, at least in this area, in IS, can graduate having spent 30 to 60 hours writing code. That's all that's required of them in their classes. Now, many of them, because they love it or they like it, they spend more time on their own, but as far as what's required of them, it's far, far less than what it used to be. And what we're trying to provide them is a way to get the experience that they should have. And this is the way that we do it.
So we have an 8-week boot camp, as I mentioned. It's 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 8 weeks, so that's 9 to 5. And as he mentioned, it's very light on actual talking. It's more on coding. And we introduce them to Git on the first day. That takes a little bit of time for them to adjust to.
And hurts their feelings.
And so we start
makes them do it from the command line.
Yeah,
she doesn't
we start with the command
GUI.
line, and then after that we show them how wonderful the IDEs can be and help you automate that. And then we go back to the command line just because. And then software design, we talk about input process output diagrams and ERD diagrams and actually structure that and help them to think through the process of breaking problems down into their smallest components, which tends to be a struggle, but we tend to have 1 to 2 weeks to do that. And then we do basic Java, so the core functions of the API. Then we talk about object orientation, and then we actually start introducing classes and methods and other things that they may not necessarily have talked about before, or they may not necessarily have used in a real life situation. Then HTML, CSS, JavaScript, because we always tell them that if your application works 100% and the user doesn't like the way it looks, then you don't really have an application, because people tend to gravitate towards what they can see and what looks pretty. So we make sure that they have the core functionality, which is strong, and then they also have presentable user interfaces. Then we have databases. We started with Oracle, also use MySQL, and also because of its ease of deployment on many different platforms, we use Postgres. And then, of course, there is Spring Boot.
Now, the great thing about Spring Boot, on top of everything that I talked about before, is the way that which you can teach it. So when we give them Spring Boot, it's possible for us to show them little lessons on, of course, we start with Hello World, and then we can just add a piece on how to create a data loader. And in isolation from everything else, they can just learn that piece. It's not like they have to figure out how to fit it in within an entire program because it's so component oriented. And then we can go on to something like deploying our application from Heroku. So basically, we've cut down a basic web application into 25 pieces. And after those 25 lessons, my promise to them is you should be able to write Amazon.com, you should be able to write Airbnb, you should be able to write Etsy. It might be slow, it might not scale, but you can certainly write it because you know how to put all the pieces together. And what we saw is not only were people able to pick this up in 8 weeks, some of the people that we were teaching, because they already had experience development, were able to pick it up much faster. And due to popular demand, we put together a 1-week boot camp where we just ran you through Spring Boot, our introduction to Spring Boot, and then they built their Twitter clone, what we call Bullhorn, over the course of 5 days, all of that all at once. And some people were very successful at that. And in fact, we had some people who their only previous experience in programming was Ruby on Rails, who went through that 1-week boot camp, and they were able to be successful and get internships with Capital One?
JP Morgan.
JP Morgan, I keep doing that. Like JP Morgan Chase and others. Our stack is Java 8. I'm glad to hear it's going to be supported for some while to come. IntelliJ, Spring Boot 2, Spring Data, Spring Security, Timeleaf, Git, and Postgres. And our outcomes, we've had 300 students go through the boot camp. Like I said, if they don't make the Friday challenge, they're out. So we've only had, so out of that 300, we've lost 102. We've had 198 completers. 108 of those are graduates. So some of our students are still currently in school, so the placement numbers don't really look right. But of those 108 people that have graduated, 89 of them are working in IT positions. And I say IT positions instead of development positions because some of them, they go through all of this, they make it to the end because they're process and goal oriented, and they're like, is this what the job is actually like? And I say yes, and it's like, I don't want to do this. But it's better to figure that out after 8 weeks than figuring that out after 4 years. So they'll move into project management positions or something like that. And I don't know about anybody here, but I've had the experience of having project managers who've never coded and don't know the pain of coding. And so having a project manager that knows how difficult it can be, and you can't just put 5 people on something and make it go 5 times faster. If that's all I've done in this lifetime, I feel like I've done my job. So that's what we're using Spring Boot for, and that's how we're teaching with Spring Boot, and I am so thankful that I found it. I can say that the one thing where I think that Java in general, and to a certain extent Spring Boot, are a little weak is in the materials seem like they're prepared for people who are CS majors. So it's not as friendly as it could be to people who are new developers, and maybe it wasn't expected to be. But since Spring Boot is so easy for new people to learn, it would be great if there were materials out there that were oriented to teaching the person who had never coded before. So rather than teaching them C++ or Swift or Logo or Scratch or something like that, I would really love if we were teaching all of our students Spring Boot as their first language. So that's what we had prepared. Any questions, comments, amusing anecdotes? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I had a quick question. What's your feeling towards having refactored code with the platform updates? Has that been a pain? Has it interfered with your coding and reusing the code over time?
Well, we haven't had a platform update in the middle of a boot camp.
Can you repeat the question?
His question was, how do we feel about having to refactor code due to platform updates? And we haven't had that happen to us in the middle of a boot camp, but we had to change our materials in between boot camps, and we found out like day 1, day 2, maybe, that, oh my God, the Spring Boot 2, this doesn't work.
Right.
So we've had to move through some stuff rather quickly to figure it out. So it has been an issue, but it hasn't been anything that stopped us. Nothing? Okay.
In the back. So initially, we teach them how to. So do we use the defaults, or do we teach them how to get around the defaults in custom configuration? So usually we start with the main defaults, and then if there's anything like the web security configurer adapter, we actually do show them step by step how to change those and how to do the database authentication and things like that.
And there's just as an additional thing, and of course we have some certain built-in traps. So we teach them to name their tables user and roles, and you can't name a table user in Postgres. So they have to learn the annotations in order to rename the tables. And some people try to change that to make it easier on the students. And I had put it there for a reason, so they would have to learn how to change that. And so that ends up being a teaching moment. Yes, sir.
Is your curriculum open source?
I don't know how to answer that. It's not explicitly open source, but if you want a copy, I'll send it to you. Okay. Yeah, if you send, if you
tweet to me.
Tweet, is that the word?
Yes.
If you tweet
if you Twitter.
feed, or you post a question on the site, I'll certainly send it to you. I have no problem with that. I think everybody should use it. Excuse me? Or use Bullhorn,
use
exactly.
Bullhorn, exactly.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just think back on the last question.
I was actually
over there. All these default changes, the changes you did at default, are those also documented in your curriculum after you've done them? Is that something that will come with the package you put out?
The question is, do we document the default changes? The answer is yes. Okay, I thought you were stretching. Okay. Yes, sir.
Do you find that people are getting dependent on television?
Pardon? That's interesting. So what I tend to do at the beginning of the class, sorry, I'm not used to this. So do we treat IntelliJ as a separate part of the curriculum, or do we let people explore it themselves, basically? So we have two, and the last release of IntelliJ actually came with a nice tutorial where you can go through it and discover the user interface. But I always make sure that I give them the key map, explain what that is, give them a few shortcuts, walk them through the general user interface, and then tell them to explore. Because part of developing independence in this curriculum is making sure that if you need to do something, you can find out how to do it yourself.
And as an add-on to that, for all of our students, I tell them to make certain, because not everybody uses IntelliJ, that they learn how to use Eclipse. But we teach with IntelliJ just mainly because of the stability and the cohesiveness of the experience with IntelliJ and Spring Boot. But also because it gives us a commonality, whereas with Eclipse, it's a little too easy for them to change things. And some people love to change things on their machines, whether I want them to or not. So I need to be able to have things locked down so I know exactly the experience that all of my students are having. But I get your point. They need to be able to know other development environments.
It seems like we're running out of time and we're hitting the break, but there's one more question, so go ahead.
Yeah, do you guys introduce testing in any form?
Do we introduce testing in any form? Yes, we cover the JUnit for individual tests and the test suite. The question is, when do we introduce it? We've tried introducing it in the beginning, so they're doing tests even with the basic Java assignments. We've done introducing it at the end, so they're only dealing with the Spring Boot assignments. We're still at heads at which works better for our students, but yes, it is something that we include.
Yes, and we're thinking about how to make test-driven development something that is introduced a little bit earlier so that we can sort of integrated, but as Alton said, we're still deciding.
Yes?
Final.
How was expulsions from the class on Friday? How has that been handled?
Well, what happens is, because of the way that the grant works, students that complete the course not only get the certificate of completion, but we also pay for them to get their AWS Developer Associate certification. So if you've been expelled, you don't get that. And if you've been expelled, we don't get to count you as a completer. But I've staffed the grant well enough that they're moved to another classroom, and as long as they want to stay, within the 8 weeks, I'll continue to teach them, but they just know that it's not like I send them home. But that seems a bit mean. But, I mean, if you don't have it, you don't have it. And not even that, it's not even a matter that you can't program. Some people can't learn in that type of high pressure environment. And it's not fair to tell them that this is the only way that you can learn. So the people that are quote unquote eliminated or kind of put in a lower pressure environment, they continue with the same information as best they can. And they just can't get the certification or the certificate of completion, but they can still get the learning.
And from what we've seen, a lot of students decide to stay. All right.
All right.
Thank you very much.